Welcome to the International Association of Yoga Therapists Licensed Healthcare Practitioner and Yoga Therapy Task Force's first webinar with John Weeks. You'll find links at www.lhcpiayt.org, the web address on the bottom of the frame here, to all the resources that we list during the seminar. I hope you enjoy the webinar. Welcome, everyone. I'm Matt Taylor, and we're sure pleased to have you here. And I think this is going to be a discussion that's going to snowball into lots of other important discussions. So we're really happy you joined us this afternoon. The task force for IAYT for initiating and expanding this dialogue about the relationship between licensed healthcare practitioners and the IAYT and the yoga therapy profession has been going on for a bit, and it's gaining quite a bit of steam. On the panel with me today are the two co-leaders of that task force, and that would be Kelly Maple-Bethel and Marlisa Sullivan. They're actually the roses between the two thorns of John and me, at least on my screen. and they're doing a great job early on in the chat, and at the end we'll also post it again, but there are the links to our closed Facebook page where you can keep abreast of this information if you're not familiar with that. And then we've posted an article that was published in this summer's edition of IAYT's Yoga Therapy Today on the topic as well. So we'll put those up at the end and place that on the Facebook page for you too. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce our guest speaker today. And gosh, you're in for a treat. I've had the good pleasure of knowing John Weeks for, it's over 10 years now, probably 11 years, John. And we first met, I was on an advisor to IAYT at board of directors at the time, and the profession was trying to decide, how do we become a profession, and what things do we want to do, but what things don't we want to do. And so we were fortunate enough to get the good counsel of John. And John's been in this integrative health business since I think 83. Yeah. And he's been an activist. He's gotten groups going. I had the privilege of being with the group he started of the licensed complementary and alternative care. And that's all in his bio there. You can read that in depth. But presently, he's also the managing editor of the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine, and he's also spearheaded the more recent Integrative Healthcare Policy Consortium, which is a group of dedicated professionals across the country to serve as intermediary and policy advisors and deal with the people that make policy and inform them of the power of complementary and alternative therapies, one of which is the yoga therapy. So you didn't sign on to listen to me prattle on and on. So what I'd like to do then is turn the microphone over to John, and we've got the record button going. We've got John here. We're ready to go. So welcome, John. Thanks very much for being here.
Very good. Thank you. Is my screen showing correctly there?
Yeah.
So thank you, Matt. It is a pleasure looking back across the years to, I guess, 2007 when I came to the IAYT meeting. And of course, the more recent experience this summer was a real pleasure to be with you there. For any of you who have not read the article that's on the site, that was actually written by 3 people with Matt's name on top, I recommend it to you. I think it kind of goes honestly into many of the challenges and brings them out of the woodwork. I will say about IAYT that I am a fan of open process, and that has been my experience with IAYT in its efforts to create standards and move things forward. Now, I'm not close enough to know everything that may be going on behind the scenes, But from my perspective, it's just been great at open process, and I think the ideas that are brought out there, and hopefully that you think will be brought out here, will be useful to you. So maybe I should have checked to see if I could advance my slides.
Down arrow?
Down arrow is just not doing the job.
Return?
Enter. So, it's literally frozen up. So,
how about next? If you go up and hit next. There we go.
Well, there's a workaround if I need to. So this was actually what Matt and his co-authors said in the article that I just referenced that I would be speaking about. And you know, just for background, I worked deeply in the revitalization of the naturopathic medical profession for a decade in the 80s when they were doing their standards work and like IAYT has been doing over the last decade. And then I have had opportunities to work with virtually all of the other integrative health disciplines, including IAYT, massage therapists, acupuncturists, the chiropractors on up through the integrative medical doctors. And so kind of by learning on the street rather than studying the sociology of professional formation, I've come up with a few answers to this. And this is the biggest one, this is the typical way people have responded, is reactively. And by that I mean typically with fear, with great concern, with you know, a very kind of lower chakra event, definitely. And so I honor you now, and well, again, that you are taking this up proactively. It's the right place to be as you go forward. So I'm going to start with a few stories from other fields, and some of them aren't exactly where you are, but I'm thinking that in telling these stories, you'll see some points of reflection, and we'll be able to and see how the choices that the professions made at the time harmed them, helped them, and could provide guidance for yoga therapists. So this first one was really a pleasure for me. I was invited to this meeting of the Pan American Health Organization that was actually in Managua in early June. And they brought together the leaders for traditional medicine from throughout South America, Central America, the Caribbean, to begin to look at the idea of forming a collaborative network to support each other's efforts to carry out the charge that's in the World Health Organization's 2014 plan, which essentially was to figure out how to bring their language was the products, practices, and practitioners of traditional medicine into the delivery of services in order to strengthen the ability of creating primary care for all. Beautiful charge. But here we had people who are seriously ancient traditional practitioners confronting, we had somebody from the NIH at this meeting, somebody from the Consortium of Academic Health Centers for Integrative Medicine. One of the very interesting dialogues that came up was about colonialism in medicine. It was, you know, the people there are much closer to the whole experience of having their land taken from them, their medicines taken from them. And so this idea, which is not the way we tend to talk about things here, came forward. I will say that as I reflected, that I felt that many of the responses of people I have worked with in the United States and North America who are from the licensed complementary disciplines or the unlicensed ones have often had a very similar gut response, that what's going to happen here is I get into relationship with the them out there, is that they have more power than we do, and we're going to end up in a subordinate role. They're actually not going to understand us. We're not going to be able to practice in the full way that we are able to practice, and it's all going to be a mess if we get into that kind of integrative medicine that they were seeing as being MD dominated, not interprofessional, which is a really nice concept that actually values deeply what each discipline brings to the table. So this idea that began to be talked about there was about articulated medicine. And there was actually a straw poll at the end of the people that were present, and most of them said, we favor speaking of what we're doing as how to best articulate the relationship between traditional and complementary medicine and conventional medicine. So it was a protective move that was meant to try to hold on to the richness of their traditions, the richness of practice that they know did not fit through the eye of that needle of reductive single agent placebo-controlled randomized trial that tends to be the gold standard of conventional medicine. So interesting learning, one strategy for protection and for assertion of what they were pushing for. I think that this kind of keeping in your mind this kind of colonial framework is not a bad thing. It's not to project it everywhere and assume that it's there. I happen to be a believer that those who have financial power and tend to exert it, and they tend to do it unintentionally, even when they're not trying to. The best-hearted people who have more power will tend to not know what they're assuming that somebody who has less power can't assume. And so these concepts of exploitation, appropriation, the way that that's felt internally may not actually be the intention from somebody you're working with who has more power in the relationship, but it may, in a sense, be happening because that seems to be the nature. We as humans tend to immediately mistrust at some level those who are more powerful, those who are the other as we walk into these relationships. So again, I don't think it's a bad thing to keep in mind. I don't think it's a thing that you want to have rule you. It's to be conscious of that instinct inside you. So the second group is what happened with the licensed acupuncturists. So historically, it was David Eisenberg's study in the early 90s that created the integrative environment. There had been a few medical doctors at that time that had taken the Helms course. Joseph Helms taught a continuing education course out of UCLA for medical doctors and osteopaths. And but most of the acupuncture that anybody was seeing at that time was through the growing field of licensed acupuncturists, who still are the dominant providers. And so they're a full, as you will know, discipline with basically 3 to 4 years of education beyond some prerequisites that they have to have in order to join that field. The battle basically began very early, in which it was articulated very early as the dialogue began about whether or not a person would need to have a licensed acupuncturist level of training in order to become an acupuncturist. Now, 2020 hindsight would say it was a foregone conclusion that that was never going to be what would happen. But that being said, there was a group within the licensed field that said, you know what, we ought to throw open our doors. There are a lot of ways to apply needles. A lot of practitioners can apply needles. As some of you may know, the NADA protocol, the 5 points in the ear, is a pretty simple method that has been proved to be actually quite successful with addiction, stress, many other things, that has a very low threshold for entry. And one group got together, convened, and issued what was called the Seattle Statement. I think it was 1996. Bob Duggan was associated with that group, as was Liza Goldblatt, who you know, Matt. And it was really saying, let's open the field. But in that context, let's try to understand and respect the differences in our education levels inside of that field. Well, another set of folks basically said, no, we're going to battle. And the triple AOM at that time split into 2 national associations. One of them that became the double AOM, I don't know if I can reconstruct the actual acronym. The other was the Acupuncture Alliance. It's my view that that profession has actually never recovered from that split. It formally reconnected in, I think, 2006 or 2007, but the steam was somehow lost out of it. Now it's just splintered, and frankly has no solid voice nationally at this point. The fight against medical doctors clearly was, a loss. Apparently in Hawaii is the one state, at least it was, where medical doctors have to have a licensed acupuncturist level of training in order to practice. But a lot of that energy was just spent in a losing battle. Now it has been redirected, and Brother Matt, you will know something about this, because there's been an invention of something. There's a great deal of dispute and counter history being claimed between advocates of dry needling and the acupuncturists who say that it was just pure theft and a renaming of something in order to steal it. That is going on, in many states now, as physical therapists and others have attempted to say, oh, well, we're not actually doing acupuncture. The needles we're using are different, the tradition's different, and etc. So that battle is actually still going on, and there are a number of licensed acupuncturists who engage in that. A final comment I'd like to make here that was sort of a surprise to many of us was that as we began to look at the integration of acupuncturists as employees or practitioners in healthcare and delivery organizations, what began to happen, and we realized, was it was often the medical doctor acupuncturist would be the door opener. Politically, it was a lot easier to say yes to acupuncture if the person had an MD who walked through the door. And this is true with any of the modalities, that if they already know you, this guy's been on staff for a long time, this woman's been trusted, she ran this initiative and that initiative, and now she's saying, I want to do some acupuncture here. That's a basis for a yes. That's much stronger than somebody from a distinctly separate discipline that we're not really aware of, we're not really sure of its standards, walking in on their own. But what we found happened was, if the program took off, it was typically the medical doctor who ended up bringing in the licensed acupuncturist afterwards. And a reason for that was that the licensed acupuncturist tended to cost less. And so as a business model, it did not best serve the organization to have a licensed practitioner who perhaps you need to pay at a nurse's level or a physician's level, or you name what it is, providing you yoga therapy. That once we've got accustomed to the therapy and the practice, that it makes sense from a business level to bring somebody in who probably is going to deliver it for less. So third example, and this was very close to home. I spent from 1983 to 1993 in the revitalization of this profession. And, it's essentially an integrative profession, with a strong medical sciences and a very eclectic use of a variety of practices from, frankly, a variety of other professions. It put itself in a very interesting place, kind of historically, relative to integrative medicine as it emerged, because the naturopathic profession itself was already deeply eclectic and existed as a composite of stuff from other places that they've chosen to bring in. Some things from the herb tradition. So there in some states, they'll use needles as medical doctors use and are licensed to do that. They'll bring in literature about nutrition from conventional medicine, from the corners of medicine have done that. Mind-body practices from the people who began to develop that literature. Their issue was here was an established profession involved in, respected in, by insurers, by Medicare, Medicaid. They're getting all kinds of money from all sorts of sources, who are now saying we are going to be the integrative practitioners. And you may not know it, but actually we know now that leaders of the functional medicine movement and of the integrative medicine movement, including Tracy Gaudet, who worked with Andy Weil in developing the integrative medicine program, said, oh, yeah, we were definitely looking deeply at what the naturopathic doctors were doing to form our model. There was a lot of what we did that was based on that model. But here were the naturopathic doctors, and how were they to respond? Most of them, there were some of us, I was among them, and said, you know what, you all ought to figure out how to create a short course of some kind that will reflect the way, the reality that these folks are trained doctors. They're looking for the kind of training that you have. So put your minds to creating a way to be able to bring that population in so they don't have to uproot their families, don't have to move to your own cities in order to get the training. It was basically a non-starter. There were a couple of dialogues that began early. There was a later dialogue with Mimi Guarneri, and this is like in 2010, 2012, 2014. But mainly it was just kind of a head in the sand. We're not going to do that. They'll be able to get this credential quicker than we would, and they'll have the credential. Plus, they've already got insurance coverage, so they'll have an upper hand. My own view on this was much more, I suppose, based in hope, faith, and in a view of human nature that says that these people would be most likely to be advocates for the full-on naturopathic doctors who did a full 4 years in a residential training program once they open the doors with that standard. And if you have a large group of medical doctors who are integrative medical doctors who are MD, NDs, again, imagine what the landscape would look like today if a large subset of the integrative MDs had an ND after their name. It was a road not taken. It was a risk viewed as too risky. And so basically the profession has, it's in a tough situation, I would just say right now, because it's attempting to create primary care integrative positions for themselves, and increasingly some of that training, partly because of the cost of naturopathic training, is beginning to look more and more like medical doctor training, and I would say some of the distinctive features are being rubbed off in that process. So some of my general, and this is, I'm basically going to close with this, I've got one other slide. What you're doing now is really smart, and it's smart in general to be proactive, but it's also smart to be the first ones to set a standard, right? If you look down my bullet points there, if you help set the bar, you can help decide whether or not that pole vaulter's bar is down just above the mat or it's up a little bit higher. And you can develop the rationale. You can create the white paper that explains why this is a good standard, and really thinks through how best to create the relationship. I mean, it was the road that the naturopathic doctors, for instance, didn't take. And the acupuncturists, I don't even know that it was really part of their dialogue to get in and talk about what a short course might be. In acupuncture, if they were to develop an ideal short course. As we talked about this inside of what was then ACAC, now is the Academic Collaborative for Integrative Health, back when I met Matt, it was a distinction between modality training and professional training. Are you being trained to deliver, to use needles for specific conditions, which is a lot of what happens in MD use of needles. It's usually for pain, there's a limited focus, and it's all about needles. You're not touching Tui Na, you're not touching moxibustion, you're not talking about touching Chinese herbs, you're not touching the whole practice. My guess is that with your intersection with some of the other licensed practitioners, some of the modalities and practices in yoga therapy are similarly going to be of less interest than are others. And I mean, I would guess up front that the sort of stretching modalities would be the easiest to adopt. The helping to bring people into a sort of yogic mind, and the mind-body side of it, probably not so much. But what we always sought to do with our work, I mean, it was, I guess, more of a fancy than we ever realized it, but was to actually, if you think back to the Seattle Statement Group, if you say, we want everybody with reasonable training for the way that they're going to use needles to be able to use needles. So if that's ear acupuncturist, it's this much. If it's MD acupuncturist for pain conditions, it's this much. But we want you to recognize that that's not the whole practice of acupuncture. And it's a far cry from the whole practice of traditional Chinese medicine. You all are going to have a very parallel situation, I would guess. And again, I'm beyond myself with what I'm saying here. So when some of you can clarify it for lately if I'm going astray. Optimally, in an optimal world, another practitioner who is leaning into your field and saying that modality will be useful to me and my patient some of the time. You want that person to go, And you know what? The work of a full-on yoga therapist may be what you need. I tried this modality and we didn't get where we wanted to go. And I think part of that might be the shortcomings of my own training in this area. Rather than putting the brunt of the negativity, the failure event, whatever, on the yoga therapy, it's to actually grow up and grow into an idea that I've got a limited modality practice here, and it does not define yoga therapy. If I was to send this person to somebody who's done the 1,000-hour course, there may be a lot more benefit than that they can give this person than I could. My third bullet here is the experience I was sharing about medical acupuncturists, inviting licensed acupuncturists in, hiring them in various places. If the people of the United States have the optimal and best use of yoga therapy in their healthcare in the future, chances are there's going to be a lot of work out there for people. And the people who are first in the door as nurses or doctors or physical therapists or whomever else might have this additional yoga therapy training is likely going to be the person who will be making a case for why and how to bring in additional people who are specifically trained. I don't have my time. Let me see. Okay, I see it. I'm okay. The last bullet here is, and I think you all are doing a pretty good job, is just keep your eyes open and keep your scanning of the field open to where people are organizing and developing new strategies around yoga therapy and how it's being brought into new places. And just insert yourself into the dialogues, not as the dominating or dominant force, but as people who actually have a lot of knowledge, experience, connectivity. I like the idea of dialogue remaining open and being open wherever possible. I think you'll benefit from it. As I heard just before the call, that you're looking at perhaps developing some sort of training, such as I actually developed these slides without hearing it. So I wasn't paid to come in here and endorse where you're going. I did just learn this before the call, and I think it's really the smart way to go. And of course, to set that bar the best way, you should be talking inside of the IYT, and you should be talking outside to people in these professions, the other practitioners, to really get their ideas from them about directions. I'll go to questions after what some of you will know, and those who were there in June will recognize this slide, but it's a standard way that I like to close my talks, and it's because it's a unifying and I think empowering statement, and it comes from a global paper that was published in 2010 that was really looking at health professionals for the 21st century, and it was published in The Lancet. If you don't know, it's one of the top 3 or 4 most impactful journals in medicine. And what they do here is they talk about how education itself has changed as the environment has changed. So back when the Flexner Report, which is sort of famous for elevating really tertiary care-based, science-based medicine, the whole focus was on creating people who were experts. Mid-century, there was more of a focus on the development of professions and yourself as a professional. What they're seeing now in the context of the rapidity of change, the internationalization both of our populations and of our therapies, the rapidity of change, the intrusions and the abilities we have through technology, is that we need to be engaging in a kind of learning that's transformative, that's preparing people not for staid environments, but to realize they're going to be working throughout their lives in changing environments. And in order to be responding, you need to be thinking in leadership ways. And where you need to be leading is in appropriate change, is to actually see your work as you're going forward as change agents. And I say this to you as yoga therapists, because this is, you know, that bottom line, when I read it, it was like heaven to me. It's my 35 years of work in this field has all been about transforming healthcare and how do we lead this and how can we become change agents to do it. This is a charge that everyone who educates for healthcare needs to be thinking into those buckets. And that every one of us, as we come out into the world, needs to be coming out into the world as a change agent. So I will cut to any commentary from those, and corrections from those who've invited me. And I've kept on this screen my little sort of awkward Convergence sign down the right, which I found on the web, that I love because it is such a awkward presentation of convergence. And I think that that's the nature of these games. As you converge with licensed practitioners, it's going to be a little edgy. It's going to be a little pointed sometimes. It's not going to be easy, but it is going to be two rivers flowing together. And that's the convergence. On the other side, I just thought I'd put Pizarro's face up, because it just doesn't hurt to pay attention to who you are and to pay attention to what means the most to you, what you're willing to let go of and in what ways and in what context, and how you are going to guarantee you hold on to what's most important to you. So thank you very much.
Oh, that's great, John. Why don't you go ahead and drop the share screen, but we're going to put all your contact information and that up on the
okay.
And the listeners, participants, at the bottom of your screen, if you scroll over, you should find a little chat button for the listeners or for the participants.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and if you want to ask a question of John, just go ahead and hit that chat button and type it in, and then we'll be feeding them to John as we go here. So we want your participation. We want this dialogue to happen. So go ahead and type them in and send them in through that little chat box. John, maybe just to kind of open, I love that last slide that you had about the transformative nature, because it is, we're living in certainly an epoch of change never before seen. And what I guess I would also recommend to our participants is we do have, and I'll put that up there too, the link to the keynote talk that John gave at Sept, because that was very much a different talk about the whole sick care delivery system and how we as licensed healthcare practitioners and yoga therapists are uniquely positioned to fulfill that slide. So he didn't have time in this talk to build that out, but it is available, and you can purchase it for, I think it's $10 or something, but it's well worth it, because it gives you a whole new set of language for understanding the power and the dynamics of what's going on in healthcare. So I'll put that up there too, John.
So I'm going to I'm going to throw Kaylee under the bus here, but I know that she's a first-year med student, and I see she's got her hand raised. So Kaylee, if you can post your question, that would be great. There you go. So Kaylee's one of our in our 200 hours, and she's also at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and she's also a first-year medical student.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to read that to John, and he can.
So her question is, thank you for your insightful talk. What advice would you give a new generation doctor who is interested in integrative medicine? I am a first-year medical student at University of Maryland with a master's in nutrition, and I'm taking the 200-hour course with me. And I'm envisioning helping form a substantial and interprofessional team of a range of integrative healthcare professionals and getting involved in healthcare policy.
Well, I just want to say that the world's going to be better when you come through and you have these skill sets, because these are wonderful places to be focusing yourself. Because you're back there, I would say bookmark the Baltimore meeting of the Academic Consortium for Integrative Medicine and Health. It's a terrific meeting, and there will likely be a good deal of yoga research there. But it's also a wonderful place to get a feeling for the environment that's developing in academic integrative medicine. The interprofessional field, the resources I would share for you is, the Affordable Care Act promoted interprofessionalism, and there was money out of HRSA that started what's called the National Center for Interprofessional Practice and Education, NCIPE. And I think it's, well, anyway, I think it's at nexusipe.org, something like that. But if you Google that, there's a whole resource open to everybody that's attempted to promote this whole interprofessional dialogue nationally. People are working on this. We in the collaborative got involved in something that's called the Global Forum on Innovation and Health Professional Education. That is at the National Academy of Medicine. Again, since you're there, there's going to be a 2-day workshop in the third week of November that is open to the public, actually. There are a lot of good resources that have come out of that work there. This is very, very challenging stuff. We are confronting, to go back to the PAHO I referenced, we're confronting tribalism here, and that tribe may be called a guild instead of a tribe, but the barriers are just as strong and challenging to get through. And I would submit it's not about the MDs. We're all locked into our ways that we came up and the way we see the world. So there's some good stuff that's come through the integrative community. I think it's been a shame that the integrative health and medicine community didn't insert itself earlier on more strong in a professional education community, because so much of what we were doing in forming these integrative centers, late 90s, first part of the century, was in confronting many levels of interprofessional dialogue. I'm in terms of policy, I'll give a plug for you. If you are interested in policy, I follow that stuff. And so if you go to the integratorblog.com, up at the upper right, it's just the site's basically flat now, but the upper right, there's a newsletter sign up, and I send out a newsletter about twice a month that has updates that basically capture most of the policy related work that's going on in the integrative health and medicine field. And I don't send you all sorts of stuff. I think the max I've ever sent in a month is like 5 things, but it's usually no more than 3. But that'll track you into some of the policy work that's going on out there. If you get really involved in something, connect with me. I'll be curious to talk with you.
Yeah, and I'll tell you that that's the truth. If John doesn't know, he knows the person that knows. And but that newsletter is great. It's concise. You get the little. It's easy to scan through to see what gets your interest. So it's definitely suggest that. It's free. It's
sponsored, actually, which is nice. I have a philanthropic partner who kind of allows me to do this for free.
Exactly. I had a question before we go to the next one. When you talked about the difference between modality and professional training, I thought that was excellent language for us to become aware of. If I'm a physical therapist that's just teaching asana is much different than if I'm coming from the paradigm or the worldview of I'm a yoga therapist and asana is one of my tools.
Yes.
Do you have any guidelines or maybe things people can do to start to play with that concept so we get a little more facile on
So who I am indebted to on kind of helping to shape that language was my co-presenter in 2007 at your meeting, Pamela Snyder. And Pamela has done some good work in framing this up and creating language around it. There are old ACAC, ACIH files someplace that have this, but I would bet Pamela could, for you who are on this committee, if you're looking towards the training, I would definitely get a hold of Pamela, and she can send you to the right places to resource you up on that topic.
That's great. Great. And we got another question for John then.
Yeah, there's a couple, and can I I'm going to build on Shelley's question, and so I'll ask Shelley's question and just add a little to it if that's okay.
Sure.
So Shelley had, so part of one of the topics I was interested in your slide presentation was that tension that acupuncturists felt, and that, they split into these two, and then they've never quite come back between the people that wanted to allow LHCPs to integrate and those that didn't. And so I think with us, we have similar tension between LHCPs who became a CIYT, who want to differentiate between yoga therapists, who want to differentiate between people that are doing more of the modality specific training. So my question is about how do we alleviate this fear and tension like you talked about and so Shelley's question, just to get to her point, is it wise and important for us as LHCPs who are also yoga therapists who have the full training to work at differentiating ourselves from non-LHCP yoga therapists, to be able to demonstrate the level of training that we have to, so for example, if an LHCP yoga therapist costs more to hire than a yoga therapist, how do we humbly educate and show the public, and especially other yoga therapists, that we're different without looking or sounding arrogant or giving the impression that we're somehow better than a yoga therapist? And is it important to differentiate ourselves? So tips for doing this within IAYT. And so I've seen that same thing with yoga therapists who try to get into the healthcare system, and they're trying to find ways to get reimbursed, where a lot of the LHCPs are like, wait, you might not want to do that. So how do we begin to say who we are and to kind of go across both spectrums and to, I guess, alleviate the fear and to help prevent the kind of division that acupuncture saw?
This is where it's all at right here. Hello, Shelley, by the way. You just reach down and figure out what were the most core values you were ever raised with. And you hopefully got some good ones and you operate from there. And one of those would be that, as I was saying, you ask others to appreciate that what you are doing is and what you've put yourself through in your training, if you are a certified IAYT, is it's a more significant level of training. And you say, I can totally appreciate the value you can bring to your patients by adding these modalities to your practice. And I actually believe that if you believe it, that I have more that I can bring to that patient than you're probably doing if what you're doing is kind of adding on a modality to a regular practice of nursing or PT or whatever, and just saying, let's pull this from yoga and drop it in. That my experience is actually when I'm able to fully engage the person and bring them into the whole mind-body relationship, blah, 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 whatever your case is, make it. A good way to do that, of course, is any mirror imaging. If the PTs are in a situation, or I hate to pick on the PTs, if the other practitioner is in a situation where they're seeing somebody else doing something that they're doing without actually fully getting the nature of their practice, then point out that what's good for the goose is good for the gander here. Would you like it if somebody walked through the door? And you gotta, my wife says is try not to tone so much. So everybody working on not toning quite so much is probably good in the process. But it's hard, it's hard stuff. There are those who will just believe that, I can come in and rip the family jewels away from you and take them on, and there's going to be no loss, and I'm basically as valuable as you could ever be, and that's that. And there you just apply the serenity prayer. I'm a great fan of the applied serenity prayer. Is you walk into the situation, you change those things that you can, you let go of those that you can't, and there's some people that simply are impossible. and there will be some people, we have this is an intensely interprofessional dialogue we're talking about. So we have a rule in the collaborative, as we have at IHYPC, when we're bringing in new board members, we do something that's called the plays well with others check. We put out the word to everybody we know is, do you know anything about this person that would make us think he or she is not a good person to bring into this meeting? So that we have somebody who's going to dominate, who's not going to listen, who's not going to realize that there are multiple voices here that need to be heard, and there's places where you need to go, you're right. I had that wrong. You need to find people who can say those things. And if they can't say it, you're kind of stuck and go someplace else, as long as that person's empowered. That's what I would say, actually.
That's great. Yeah.
So it's part of that, like the development of that, like having groups come together to do something like the white paper you discussed.
Yeah, I think that if I love that you're moving towards kind of looking, what would a standard be for training for these folks? I think it's a great idea. And a classic way to start a process like that, the only way, is to actually kind of start with a white paper of some sort, where you're looking at kind of what are the issues, what do people want, poll, you kind of at least informally poll a dozen or a couple of dozen people from. Let me share a process that I've had the opportunity to lead in the past when I was a consultant to the Sisters of Providence here in Seattle, when the naturopathic doctors in 1995 suddenly were covered by insurance. And there were 45 primary care clinics. They wanted to figure out how to bring naturopathic doctors in. The naturopathic doctors weren't accustomed to being insurance or working side by side with medical docs. Medical doctors knew nothing about them. We did a process where I called it integration as community organizing, where we literally got 8 of each into a room, and they sat down at tables, and we worked in dyads, and we worked at tabletop, and we worked at the whole group around 2 questions. First question was, I think we started with the positive first. What do you think are the best value that will come of us coming to some shared consensus on our next step forward in this area, right? Back then it was shared consensus, on you being able to work with naturopathic doctors and you being able to work together better. That was what we were doing. But for you, it would be, what's the shared value? And the next is, what's the risk? and you work in dyads, you know, classic co-counseling. One person talks 3 minutes, the other person talks 3 minutes, and you shut up and listen. And then you report out to the table, and then you report to the whole group. And at the end of a couple of hours of that, the learning is huge. Everything's on the table. The concerns on the one side, the human concerns, the very real concerns and issues. I'm afraid that my people will get bad yoga therapy, right? I'm afraid that my profession will be negatively portrayed and assumed to be much less valuable than it in fact is. You know, or, you know, I'm not going to be able to actually ever practice these things. And I know that it's a service to my providers if I have to go through some standard you're setting up out there, right? I mean, all this stuff will come forward. It's all in everybody's hearts and minds right now. And if you get the right, you know, 8 or 10 people together, you probably can get most 95% of the ideas that 100 people would have through a process like that. It's relationship-based sort of organizing and moving things forward.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think we have time for one more question. Kelly, you got one more?
Yep. And so I just want to back up because a few people came on late to the call, and there was a conversation at the beginning of the call that Marlisa Sullivan and I are co-chairing a task force within the IYIT that's looking at how LHCPs integrate yoga into their practices. We're looking at possibly a new credential. It won't be a CIYT, it'll be less hours, but really looking at those practitioners that don't want a full yoga therapy certification, but those that do want to begin to integrate modalities or yoga therapy into their practices. So that's what we opened with at the start of this call. So we are working on that. We're looking at what the standards would be and what that certification might look like and how many hours it would be. The question that we have is from Brianna, and she says, thank you for your informative presentation. I have a question related to obtaining research funding. I'm a psychiatric nurse with a PhD in nursing with a focus on prevention and treatment of trauma across the lifespan. I hope to conduct research with trauma survivors and initiate partner violence survivors that incorporate yoga. It is somewhat difficult to get NIH funding for your IPV research. Are there any funding sources that you would recommend that are yoga friendly?
Somebody needs to shake down Gaiam at some point.
There's a lot of money in that tree.
But I don't know. I wish I knew. There's so many good ideas and so few resources to go towards them. So I
yeah. So what I might add, Brianna, is Sept Kasala, who runs the research arm of IYT, gave. And I'm not making anything off of these videos or anything, but again, I'll put the link up for that one. He gave a brilliant 45-minute summary of the challenges of research to intervention, where the money streams are drying up, how they're being led by policy and that. And I think you might, the short answer is the stream is pretty barren right now, unless you can do some big heavy study with fMRIs and blah, blah, blah. But if you listen to his talk, I think you'll also be encouraged that if we structure this the right way and are transformative agents, as John encouraged us to be, that we can really make a big difference. So I'll put that link up too, Brianna. So I don't know. There are some other questions, John. Would it be all right if maybe we let you field them and maybe do a little short post or something, or what's your preference?
So I can, if I don't know about how tight you are on wanting to close right now, I can go a little bit longer. If that's a favored thing to do. But I also could take a look at these afterwards and
yeah, why don't we, if that's all right, gang, do that, and that's the bait to have them come check in on the Facebook page, and that way we honor your time and the other attendees' time. But
good choice.
Kelly and Marlisa, closing comments or questions?
Are we going to post these on both Bridge Builders and the SIG page?
Right.
So for those that are on here, I know I have a number of my students on here. If you're interested in belonging to 2 closed Facebook groups called Bridge Builders to Awareness, which are healthcare providers, for the most part, integrating yoga into their practice, or yoga therapists. And then there's a special interest group within the IYAT. Both are on Facebook. If you request membership, we can add you, and we'll post the comments to these links on there. I think that's all I have now. So this group, the special interest groups meets every other month to review Journal Club. We have one coming in November. We're going to finish up a study on I was going to say skills. That's the wrong word. It's been a long day. On looking at 2 questionnaires for pain, right, Marlisa?
Are we doing the interception one, the Maya?
Yeah, we're doing the interception one. And then I think the next one in January will be on osteoarthritis. But all that, I will post all that probably in the coming weeks. And we do it in a very similar seminar, or similar fashion, using Zoom, so that we can all ask questions. And they're usually fairly well attended by some really top people who do a lot of good work in yoga and yoga therapy.
All right. Okay. And Marlisa, anything for John?
No, I really appreciate this presentation and your presentation at Sitar. I think what I am just left with is this question about how we can, use our skills as yoga therapists to create this interprofessional dialogue in a way that helps to mitigate that divisiveness and that fear, and also helps to, what you were saying earlier, helps to honor everybody where they are, and to appreciate where everybody is coming from, and at the same time create standards that will benefit the field of yoga therapy, that will benefit the field of LHCPs and the public. So I'm just glad to be part of this whole conversation. So thanks for coming here and talking to us about it. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much, John. And again, to the audience, we will also be posting, we've recorded this and we'll post the video so you can rewatch it. You can also share it with your friends, because we want this dialogue to be open and inclusive. And as John admonished us, not just within IIYT, but outside IIYT, the more voices that sit at the table, the better chances are we can make this all work. So John, always a pleasure. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Great pleasure to be with you all again. It's fun to be part of your process all these years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And participants, thank you for your participation as well.
Yes, thanks.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night.
All right.